Greetings, my fellow knights. Tonight we journey deep into the past to uncover the entire history of the Olmecs, America's first great civilization, shrouded in mystery and known for their colossal stone heads and lasting influence. But before you drift into comfort, I ask you, as a fellow knight of these tales, to like and subscribe, and in the comments, share what legends or histories you would have us explore next. Now, let us begin. The land lay broad and level, with slow rivers and wide swamps running from the Tuxtla Hills to the Gulf. In these centuries around 2000 to 1400 BCE, the Coatzacoalcos Basin and the low wetlands of Veracruz and Tabasco held shallow lakes, narrow levees, and long strips of mangrove. Mud clung to ankles. The sea lay just beyond, with inlets and lagoons that sheltered fish and birds. Inland the ground rose a little, enough for houses and stores to stay dry in most years. Storms came in some seasons, and long rains fed the channels. By late summer, rivers often spilled their banks and spread thin layers of dark earth. In the following season, the waters pulled back and left flats that were ready for planting. The land gave signs that people learnt to read. A certain bend held firm soil. A certain island stayed above the water most of the year. A sandbar marked a crossing. These were the quiet notes of a place that set the pattern, and the pattern endured. The people were families who counted on one another. Elders held memories of roots, fish runs, and the right time to plant. Younger adults cleared brush, set posts, and paddled canoes. Children helped gather firewood and watched the banks for rising water. Smoke from cooking fires drifted slowly. Some people knew the best place for seed and the sign of a healthy plant. Others shaped simple jars and bowls and built new hearths when the old ones cracked. Skilled hands made nets from plant fiber and carved hooks from bone. A few traders visited from the west and from the hills. They brought stories, a new tool, or a stone with a color not seen before. Marriages tied villages along the river, and visits kept the ties strong. There were people who watched the sky and spoke simple words at the start of planting. There were people who treated fevers and knew which leaf eased a stomach. Households, kindred lines, and neighbors formed the small circles of trust. In these ties, tasks were shared, and decisions held firm. Change came in steps that seemed modest at first. Families chose natural levees for house mounds, and planted maize on the edges, where the soil kept its strength after the floods. They burned brush, opened plots, and learned to return ash to the ground. They set digging sticks and pressed beans beside maize to climb the stalks. They planted squash to shade the soil. The river current pulled steadily. When the waters rose, they used canoes to move firewood and baskets of grain to a higher platform. They learned to store maize in sealed pottery and to use baskets for quick carrying. They marked the months by the moods of water and by the call of birds in certain times of the year. They made fish weirs from stakes and brush, and checked them at low water. They built simple causeways across the wet ground between clusters of houses. Pottery spread from older coastal villages, and people began to cook and store in new ways that saved time and food. Life in the villages remained steady during these years. In these decades, paths between hamlets grew more sure. Canoes followed channels that were learned by patient travel, and levees joined the steps of neighbors into a firm line. Boats bumped softly against a log. A man from upstream traded shells for a new blade of black glass from distant hills. A woman from a lakeside village brought a fine bowl in exchange for dried fish. A worker found a green pebble in gravel and kept it as a prized thing. People shaped small figurines from clay and placed them in house floors with care. They raised low earthen platforms to keep homes out of the wet. They kept seed from good harvests and set it aside in dry jars. When the dry season ran long, they dug shallow ditches to draw water toward their plots. When a flood came early, they waited and planted later. A few elders began to keep count of seasons with strings of knots or marks on posts. A few gatherings brought families together to share food and to speak respectful words for planting or harvest. In time, some people guided these meetings and settled quarrels with calm speech. These customs would continue in the years ahead, and the small steps added weight to the land's memory. All this quiet practice formed the base for what followed on the Gulf Plain. The rivers set life to a measured pace, and people shaped their tasks to match it. Distant surf sounded faint. The broad lowlands taught patience, and patience made families strong. The learned ways of clearing, raising, storing, and moving by water set the outline of towns that came later. In the coming centuries, earth would be moved in greater amounts, and stone would travel from the Tuxtla Hills. Before that work began, these early farmers and fishers fixed their homes to small rises and taught their children the river's turn. The old places gained names and stories, and some points on the rivers became steady anchors for trade and ceremony. Later centers rested on this ground, in both soil and memory. The foundations were in the levees, the canoes, the jars, and the fields. Life continued in this way for a time. Chapter 2. Raising San Lorenzo on the ridge of water. San Lorenzo took shape when families in the Gulf lowlands chose a long ridge and decided to make it their center. They did not rush. They watched the seasons and learned where the water slowed and where the land stayed firm. They moved earth with baskets and hands, forming platforms and leveling spaces for gatherings and homes. They cut shallow channels to guide rain away, then deepened them when they saw where the flow needed help. In these years, the work felt steady and patient, and it showed in the ground they shaped. Leaders began to stand out during this early effort. Some led crews during heavy tasks. Others kept track of stored food and tools. A few spoke for the group during meetings, helping settle where to build and when to pause. By the time the ridge had its first real plaza, the place had a name and a path of growth. The air was warm. The ridge sat between branches of a broad river system, in lowlands where rain visited often and the soil held plenty. In early planting seasons, water rose at the edges, and the ridge felt high enough to give safety during floods. From the top, people saw water shimmering in flat sheets across the plain, and they learned the routes of creeks and backwaters. They marked places where the ground sloped gently and places where it dropped off. The ridge had pockets of clay and sandy loam, so different parts suited different tasks. One area held potential for a main plaza, another made sense for households, a third would take storage pits and sheds. The air smelled of wet earth. Families lived together in small groups, with elders in each line speaking for the younger ones. Work parties formed under steady hands who knew the line of the fields and the flow of water. These hands belonged to people who were not kings, but they had trust from many. There were planners who chose where to cut a drain or raise a slope. There were water minders who watched for leaks and weak spots. There were stone workers who chipped tough rock for tools and later for drains. There were ritual keepers who tended small shrines and marked seasons with simple rites. Traders visited from nearby settlements to check on harvests and exchange goods. Children learned tasks by standing close and carrying small loads. A low drumbeat carried during workdays. The first steps of raising San Lorenzo began with clearing brush and marking lines with stakes. They measured with footsteps and sight lines to set the edges of a plaza. Crews filled shallow depressions with packed soil and clay, layer by layer till the surface held flat. Other crews dug channels along the sides to carry runoff to safer places. They built earthen platforms for houses, so doors and floors stayed above standing water. As the work grew, they used heavier tools for roots and hard spots, and saved finer work for smoothing surfaces. They tested the drains during storms, watching the flows, and opened outlets where needed. In some stretches, they lined channels with hard material to stop collapse. They kept this effort going each season, with repairs after heavy rains and improvements after lessons learned. The soil felt gritty in their hands. Over time, the ridge changed from a natural rise into a planned terrace with tiers and paths. People could walk from one part to another on firm ground, even during the wet months. The plaza held gatherings for talk, trade, and meals. Leaders used this space to show care for the common needs and to receive respect in turn. Food storage improved, and seasonal feasts brought the work crews together. A small set of drains fed into basins, making controlled pools for water near the plaza. Some parts of the water system used shaped stone where the flow needed strength. Households on the higher tiers held finer goods and had workers attached to them. Households on lower slopes stayed busy with fields and craft work. Children grew into roles, and visitors saw a place that looked prepared and tended. The smell of cooked maize carried across the plaza. San Lorenzo's gentle rise showed a way of building that fit the lowlands well. Earth and water came first, and leadership grew from the work of managing both. This care made the ridge safe during storms and kept daily life steady, even when floods spread across the plain. Patterns formed here that would carry into later years. The making of platforms and plazas, the guiding of water with channels and drains, the gathering of people around shared tasks, and the rise of families who coordinated large efforts. In time, more stone would reach the ridge and stand in the plazas, and the voice of rule would grow clearer in ceremonies. For now, the ridge held its shape and its order, and people rested at day's end with the sound of night insects steady at the edges. Life continued in this way. Chapter 3. Basalt, rafts, and the making of memory stone began to move across the water in these years, and with it the shape of life at San Lorenzo changed. Basalt from the Sierra de los Tuxtlas traveled from the high, rough country to the low, wet plains, not by miracle or sudden force, but by practice learned step by step. People found ways to use the current, the bank, and the bend of a stream to handle weights that many hands alone could not carry. They tested rafts, ropes, and poles, and they watched for seasons when travel was safest. At the end of the journey, the stone took new form. Great heads with strong faces appeared, and heavy blocks set out as thrones took their places. These pieces did not speak, but they held signs that other eyes understood. A band cut across a brow, a patterned strap along the cheek, a swirl along the mouth, or a panel at the front of a seat told parts of a story. The people at San Lorenzo already knew how to move earth and water to shape their ridge. Now they joined that work with a plan for stone. They tied the hills to the plains with long roots and steady labor, and they brought the mountain into the plaza. The stones stood in courts and along paths, and they marked where a leader sat, where processions paused, and where visitors were meant to look. They also carried memory across generations, so that when faces were no longer living, their features lived on in basalt. In this simple way, by moving stone on the water, the community gave form to the past and the present at once. The river surface looked still most mornings. In these years, the land between the Gulf and the Sierra de los Tuxtlas set the stage for this work. The ridge of San Lorenzo sat above its channels, and the Coetzacoalcos River and its branches ran toward the sea. To the south and east, dark flows and boulder fields lay on the slopes of old volcanoes, and small streams cut down from the hills. Paths ran through stands of trees, across open flats, and into villages that grew where water and dry ground met. People knew the seasons. In late rains, the rivers rose and could lift rafts. But currents turned tricky at certain bends. In dry months, sandbars appeared, and the water dropped, which made some stretches safe for work on the banks. These choices mattered, and crews planned trips to match the flow they expected. They knew where the banks were gentle, and where clay made a poor landing. They kept track of places where a raft could be pulled up and repaired. Camps along the way were known to families in both the hills and the low coast. Some stones came from near San Martin Pajapan, and some from other flows in the Tuxtlas. By any route, the journey took days, sometimes many, and it required small pauses that became part of the practice. The air was damp under the trees. The people who guided this effort came from several places and roles. There were men and women in the foothills who knew the boulder fields and could point to stones that would hold a shape. There were woodcutters who prepared straight logs for rollers and rafts, and rope makers who twisted strong lines out of plant fibers. Boat crews in river villages learned how to lash logs into sturdy platforms and how to steer through eddies. At San Lorenzo, there were carvers who grew skilled with hammerstones and pecking tools, and who understood how basalt fractured. They worked in groups, passing tasks from one to another, from rough shaping to careful finish. Families supported them with food, and with help in moving tools and water. Leaders at San Lorenzo watched over the scheduling and the placement. They made choices about which stone would become a throne and which would bear a face. Trusted people kept count of workers and supplies, and they recorded, in their own manner, the order of stones to be carved. Some from the hills joined the crews at the ridge for a season, then returned home with gifts and stories. In this way, relationships grew between villages that might not have met before. The carvers learned the character of certain quarries and flows, and crews learned how each stretch of river behaved. When hands rested on the stone at the start of work, the surface felt cool. The movement of basalt followed a steady pattern that crews refined across years. First, scouts and elders in the Tuxtlas pointed out boulders of the right size and soundness. Test blows with stone tools showed where a crack might run, or where the core was strong. If a mass was too big, the team dressed it down before moving it. Earthen ramps and brush pads helped them manage the start. They pried and coaxed the piece onto rollers, then guided it toward a stream where a raft could be built. Rafts were made of straight logs lashed and pegged, with cross pieces to hold the load. Vine and fiber rope kept bundles tight, and poles lay ready for steering and braking. With the stone aboard, crews eased into the flow when the current was calm. They set a watcher at the bow and one aft, and they called out when a snag or gravel bar appeared. Where the stream joined a larger river, more hands came out to help pass the next stretch. At bends, teams used long lines from the bank to keep the raft near the inside curve. Rest points were routine. Crews pulled up where ground was firm and where wood and water were at hand. Simple shelters took shape in places known for this purpose. When the raft reached the ridge of San Lorenzo, the hard part was not over. The stone still had to be brought from the landing up onto the platforms. Planked skids, rolled paths, and earthen ramps took the weight. People pushed, pulled, and braced, and teams with rollers moved in shifts. Once in the workshops, carvers marked outlines with red pigment, then began to reduce the block. They pecked and ground for days, then stopped to check the lines. In the end, the first forms showed: a seat with a central niche, or a head with a banded helmet and firm jaw. These methods and routes were used again and again, and they improved as new lessons were learned. Ropes rasped on wood. As the work matured, the stones took on a clear range of shapes and messages. The thrones, as people later called them, had a wide top and a recessed opening at the front. Some showed a figure seated in the niche, with cords or bars held in the hands of figures on the sides. Some heads carried broad bands on the brow, and round ornaments by the ears. Carvers emphasized eyes, lips and cheeks in ways that gave each face a distinct presence. Many believed these heads showed rulers, though names were not written in a way that can be read now. Over time, stones moved within the site as needs changed. A throne could be reused, and in some cases a throne seems to have been cut down into a head. If a plaza was remade, a head might be rotated, re-leveled, or set along a new path. Broken pieces were buried with care, not thrown off. In some places, rows of basalt cylinders were driven into the ground to form edges or enclosures, and these also had to be brought by water from the hills. Not every stone reached the ridge. Some remained near the mountain, such as a carved youth set on San Martin Pachapan that stood far from the plains. The network was broad, and not every route led to San Lorenzo. Still, at San Lorenzo the result was a cluster of monuments that marked open courts and terraces. People gathered around them for visits, talks and rites, and they remembered who had ordered them. Work at San Lorenzo remained steady in these years, and the skills of crews and carvers grew with each task. The stone faces caught the sun on clear days. The habit of moving stone on water tied the mountain and the plain into one field of work. Knowledge of rafts, ropes and channels became part of the memory of families who did this labor, and stories of a trip were passed along with tools. The carvers found a voice in basalt that could be recognized beyond the ridge, and that voice traveled with the stones to other places later on. When power shifted to La Venta, the practice of hauling basalt continued, and new patterns appeared there, including fences of upright cylinders and new thrones. The sense of how to place a monument in a court, how to anchor it, and how to make it face a certain line, all came from lessons learned earlier. The stones did more than honor leaders. They organized space, set boundaries, and gave form to gatherings. The faces may have been made for those who ruled, but the craft bound neighbors into teams and linked tasks across great distances. In the next period, these monuments and the places around them supported rites that joined sky, earth, and the ground below. For now, it is enough to see the calm work of many hands and the quiet roots that made it possible. Life went on in this way for a time, and the water moved slowly along the banks. Chapter 4. Breath of Ritual and Rule. Ritual and rule moved together in the Olmec lands. Leaders did not stand apart from the rites that steadied fields, homes, and the old places. They stood within them, guided by elders and those who knew the paths between the seen and the unseen. The people had learned to shape earth and water. Now they learned to shape time and duty. Ceremonies set the pace. They framed planting and harvest, naming and burial, exchange and alliance. A shrine could be a throne set in a plaza, a mound with a hidden heart, or a small hearth altar in a courtyard. In each setting, gestures repeated from season to season gave weight to decisions and softened tensions. In quiet processions and careful offerings, a household met its past and hoped for fair weather. A ruler met his ancestors and pledged even hands. A shaman spoke to places that did not have mouths. The smell of copal resin hung in the air. These acts did not rush. They followed known steps that had been learned by watching and by listening. In this way, the Olmec world gave its leaders a seat, and it gave families confidence that the land would answer human effort. The rites joined sky, ground, and the watery below into a plain pattern that people remembered. The setting for these rites lay where ridges rose from wetlands and where springs broke the surface near stands of trees. In these years after San Lorenzo grew strong, the main gatherings happened on its high ground and on smaller platforms around nearby hamlets. Plazas offered room to walk in order, to kneel by a carved stone, and to watch a figure seated within a niche. Stone drains at San Lorenzo carried runoff away from the open ground, and also drew notice for their steady course. Water ran softly through the carved channels. People traveled out to certain sites beyond the ridge as well. A spring at a place now called El Manatee drew visitors with its constant flow. Coastal inlets and river mouths also drew gatherings when the currents turned. Each place had a way of holding attention. A mound's flanks gave a sense of ascent. A spring's surface marked a passage. A plaza's level floor gathered feet into one pace. In these places, authority gained shape by being seen during shared time. The same places drew families when leaders were not present, and the same steps were repeated in smaller ways. Several kinds of people took up these roles. Rulers stood before their houses and before the carved stones that marked their office. They wore marked caps and bands that showed their houses and their fields. Near them stood attendants who held cloth, bundles, and tools for the rite. Shamans prepared the ground, the calendar count, and the words to be spoken. They knew stones, springs, and old paths. Elders from different households sat in plain rows. They held the memory of previous seasons and of earlier leaders. Craftspeople had a place at these gatherings as well, since they shaped masks, small figures and polished pieces that were carried and then stored. Traders who moved salt, shells and resin stepped into these scenes when their wares were part of the rite. Farmers and fishers stood and watched, and then went home to do the smaller parts at their own hearths. The stone carvings that later visitors would call altars served as seats and as doors to a remembered past. A figure shown within a niche carried the message that a leader held ties to older powers. Their hands rested on cool stone. Children learned to keep still during the words, and then to carry baskets or sweep the ground afterward. These customs would continue in the years ahead. The steps of the year brought the steps of the rite. In the dry months, channels were cleared, and the first gatherings honored the labor before planting. In early rains, seeds were placed in the fields, and a portion was set aside for the shrines. At some ceremonies, a ruler sat upon a carved seat and spoke words that joined his house to the land and to the people. A conch shell call carried across the open ground to begin the walk. Attendants brought forward stingray spines and obsidian blades that had been stored in baskets. The cuts were slight and followed set patterns, and the materials were then placed with cloth, jade pieces, and maize in a small pit. At springs and wetlands, offerings were placed in the clear water. Wooden busts, rubber balls and jade were set gently beneath the surface at El Manatee and at other watery places. In plazas, small figures and celts were arranged facing a leader, then buried and the ground smoothed. Balls were put into play for public games on cleared courts or open spaces, and the game carried meaning of contest and balance, with wagers that moved goods between houses. When a new stone was set in a plaza, it received offerings, words, and a touch from many hands before it was covered or left for viewing. People then returned to work in fields and homes. Life in the villages remained steady during these years. These acts reached beyond the day itself. They trained the next generation in memory and duty. Young attendants learned sequences of motion and speech. They learned the names of places and the order of steps. Craftspeople learned to prepare incense, to polish jade, and to wrap bundles for safekeeping. A ruler's seat gained meaning not from height alone, but from the way it was used in view of many eyes. Tribute and gifts were exchanged at the end of a rite, which balanced obligations and helped goods move where they were needed. Feasts accompanied some gatherings, and leftovers were shared out so no house felt cut off. Masks were worn for certain parts, then stored. Jade celts were set upright in the earth, and later covered with clay. Jade felt cool in the hand. Household altars took the large rites and brought them close. A mother set a small figure by a hearth for a child's naming. A father sprinkled ground with the first kernels from a harvest. The people spoke of the sky above, the ground where they walked, and the watery place below that fed springs and rivers. In this way, the ruler's claims stayed tied to daily labor, and daily labor found a voice in the leader's words. These customs gave a simple order to time and helped neighbors settle matters without sharp breaks. They also prepared the ground for new centers that would grow in the next seasons. All of this left a mark that lasted beyond the first centers. The rites at San Lorenzo and at the springs drew paths that others would follow. The same calm steps would soon be taken at La Venta, with larger plans and longer lines of people. But the heart of the matter would remain the same. Authority needed steady ceremony to be seen and accepted. Families needed a place within that order to feel secure about work, food, and care. Carvings that showed a person seated within a niche stayed in memory because they summarized this idea. The carving said that a leader had a place that touched old ground and living people at once. In these years, no single person carried the burden alone. Attendants, elders, and craftspeople held parts of the work. When a season turned, they gathered again. The night air was still. Offerings went into earth and water. Words were spoken, and the people went home to their fields and hearths. The pattern held, and life continued in this way. Chapter 5. La Venta's Long Season. In the years after San Lorenzo had quieted, the weight of planning and ceremony moved to La Venta. The place rose out of low wetlands, and people began shaping a new order there. They raised a tall earthen mound, laid out plazas, and set rows of stones in patterns meant to last longer than any one life. The alignments were careful. The main sightlines leaned a little to the west of north, and buildings were placed with a steady hand. The same rivers and the same coast fed the fields. Yet the feeling of the center changed. The old style of thrones and heads continued, but the setting grew more ordered and layered. Open courts led to closed courts. Buried spaces held offerings not meant for daily eyes. The way of rule and ritual also shifted. Rulers stood within a stronger plan, and the plan itself seemed to instruct those who walked the paths. The labor of many hands shaped the ground into terraces and walls built of earth. The memory of earlier sculptures still mattered, and the new work folded that memory into a broader ground plan. In this time, La Venta became the main voice for the Gulf lowlands. Its long season reached through several generations, holding fast to the line between sky, soil, and underworld. The air was warm. La Venta stood on high ground within a wide marsh, a firm island in a shallow sea of reeds. It sat near the edge of the Gulf, where river mouths shifted in slow bends and left new sand and silt with each flood. In these centuries, the center took shape in clusters known today as main complexes, though the people simply knew their places by paths, house groups, and courts. The Great Mound rose on the southern part, while courts and platforms stretched to the north and west. Around the island, canoe channels joined small villages and gardens. The land offered clay for building and rich soils for maize and squash. Craft workers found smooth deposits nearby and gathered kneaded stone from afar. In late seasons, when the rivers ran low, more work could be done on the dry surfaces of the island. The builders learned the rhythm of the ground and made slopes to shed rain and drains to carry water away. They kept the edges strong with packed clay and stone footings. Across the marsh, the line of the main mound could be seen from a distance, a steady marker for those approaching by water. The air was damp. The people who guided La Venta were a mix of old lineages and new families. A small circle of rulers held authority, supported by ritual specialists who kept count of days and watched the path of the sun. Close to them worked planners who learned measures by cord and stake, and who decided where to place walls, courts, and gates. They relied on seasoned crews who had moved earth at San Lorenzo and taught younger workers how to cut, carry, and tamp fill. Households from the island and outlying farms brought maize, fish, and salt for the workers. Carvers and polishers fashioned green stone and basalt, their skills passed down in houses that doubled as workshops. Traders arrived from coast and inland, exchanging tools, shells, and rare stone in steady, quiet visits. Children grew up near the plazas and learnt the paths by following elders to errands and ceremonies. Extended families took care of altars and small shrines, sweeping the surfaces and leaving small offerings on named days. When rulers met to decide on a new building phase, they called trusted heads of work crews and outlined tasks across the seasons. In this way, decisions at the center reached the edges of the island and beyond, then returned in the form of labor, food, and stone. Copal smoke drifted. The work of La Venta unfolded in measured steps. Planners marked the northward line, slightly turned to the west, and set stakes at key points. Workers trimmed the ground and laid the first layers of fill for the great mound, building lifts that rose by stages. They packed the earth with their feet and with tools, making each layer firm before adding the next. In other courts, masons dug rectangular pits and set down blocks of green stone in careful designs. When a pattern was complete, they covered it with clean clay and sealed it, so that only the ground above showed the work was done. Around a sacred court, crews set upright basalt columns side by side, forming a ring that made a wall without mortar. The columns came by river from the Tuxtla Hills, moved on rafts and pulled by crews along the banks. On certain days, a throne of basalt was dragged into place, or a head was set on a prepared platform. Walkways were raised to keep feet out of the wet, and drains were cut to move water away from plaza floors. A central axis connected major courts, and smaller axes tied house groups to the main places. These steps repeated in cycles, with repairs, renewals, and additions marked by new layers of clay and sand. Crews kept their tools in small sheds, covered them at day's end, and began again when the sun returned. Baskets creaked. As the center matured, its plan grew more refined. The great mound reached a steady form, its sides kept true by regular maintenance. The rings of basalt columns were strengthened, and new courts appeared at the edges with small platforms for household rites. Offerings of jade celts, hematite mirrors, and other valued things were set in clusters, then sealed beneath hard floors. Processions followed known paths, moving from open courts to bounded precincts, where only a few entered. The rules of access were understood, and order kept the center from confusion. Some older monuments were moved, buried, or broken, a sign that new times called for new arrangements. When a building phase ended, workers smoothed floors and spread light-colored clay to mark the close. Visitors from other towns would have seen a tall mound, a sequence of courts, and a landscape shaped to guide the steps of a crowd. The influence of La Venta reached outward in these years, touching villages toward the Tuxtla Hills and along the coast. Traders carried news of ceremonies and forms of carving as they haggled over stone and salt. Life in the city remained steady during these years, with repairs in the dry season, planting in the rains, and gatherings on named days. The ways of La Venta would travel along paths in the years ahead, joining people in jungle and highland. Dust rose in the plaza. The plan of La Venta left a long trace. The offset north line would be seen again in later places, and builders in distant valleys would remember how courts and mounds could be tied to the turn of the sun. The practice of burying designs and treasured objects beneath floors set a habit of making memory in the ground. The ring of upright columns showed one way to shape a wall that was both strong and open. The careful use of layers with clean clays marking episodes taught later workers how to keep structures sound across seasons. The sculptures of rulers and the seats they used continued the message that authority sat within an ordered space. The mound and its courts told a clear lesson about planning that outlasted any single person. When times changed, La Venta kept its stance for a while longer, then eased from the center of affairs as new places drew people and goods. What it had set in place did not vanish. It lived in habits of building, in alignments checked at dawn, and in ways of closing a shrine by burying its heart. In the next chapters of the region's life, paths would run farther through forest and ridge, and hands would give new shapes to stone and clay. The mound at La Venta remained where it stood, a quiet hold on the land. The mound cast a steady shadow. Chapter 6. Paths through jungle and highlands. In these centuries, the Olmec world reached beyond the Gulf Coast. Not by conquest, but through quiet exchange. People walked old paths and cut new ones, and they moved along rivers that slid toward the sea. Goods changed hands many times, passing from village to village and town to town. The flow was not only of things, it also carried ways of doing, ways of carving, ways of marking time, and the steady habits of ceremony. The paths tied the lowland swamps to highland valleys and dry basins, and they did so with patience. From where La Venta stood firm, people moved outward along water and earth. From highlands and coasts, people moved inward, toward the green lowlands. They met in courtyards and by landings, and they sealed ties with shared meals and gifts. In these years the circle widened to Oaxaca, to the central valleys beyond the mountains, to the Pacific coast of Chiapas and Guatemala, and to the rough hills in Guerrero and Morelos. From those places came sharp stone, bright green stone, and iron-rich minerals ground to shine. From the coast came salt and shells. From warm groves came cacao and cotton thread. From rubber trees came solid cakes for balls and sealing jars. The air was warm. Paths and waterways set the shape of the web. The Coatzacoalcos and Tonalá rivers fed the exchange toward the east, and the Grijalava and Usumacinta linked farther lands to the south. Canoes moved through lagoons behind the sandbars, and then up broad channels under leaning trees. Trails rose to the passes on the flanks of the Tuxtla Hills, and then onward into the ranges that led to Oaxaca and Morelos. Other trails climbed the Sierra Madre toward the Soconusco Plain, and the high valleys beyond. In the rainy season, porters chose ridges and waited at fords. In the drier months, they followed riverbeds and crossed sandbars at low tide. They used tumplines on their foreheads to carry weight. They traveled in small groups for safety and company. They planned days by distance to water and shelter. They watched the weather and the height of streams. Both near and far, the river made a low sound. Different people played their parts. Canoe pilots knew the bends and sandbanks, and the best places to pull ashore. Porters knew the passes, and the rest spots that sat in the shade of old trees. Traders who bargained for leaders had careful words and a steady manner. Rulers at La Venta and other centers sent envoys with gifts to open doors and confirm ties. Craftspeople shaped samples to carry as models, so that distant makers could see the form of a mask, a celt, or a mirror. Farmers grew cacao and cotton where the land allowed it, and they brought surplus to meeting grounds. Families on the routes hosted travelers, and they gained news and small goods in return. In valleys to the west, San Jose Mogote joined the web. In the basin beyond the mountains, Tlatilco joined as well. In the hills of Morelos, Chalcatzingo took part. Farther to the southwest, Teopantiquanitlan had its place. Across the borderlands to the south, Abaj marked a reaching hand from the Pacific slope. In every place, some accepted new forms, and others held to older ways, yet the conversations continued. Obsidian edges looked bright. Step by step, the movement of things had its pattern. In the high Motagua Valley, workers gathered green stone from riverbeds and cut rough shapes. They brought the pieces to the next meeting place, where another group took them farther. At the Pacific Plain, porters turned north across low gaps, or they followed the coast to a river mouth. At each handoff, someone checked the count and gave a return. In the highlands of Guatemala, people broke obsidian cores into blanks and carried them down to the big rivers. Others moved obsidian from El Chayal, San Martin Hilotepeque, or Ixtepeque toward the Gulf. Shell came inward from the mangrove shores and the reef line, packed in baskets with salt. Iron ore, magnetite and hematite moved from upland sources to lowland workshops where mirrors were polished. Rubber from forest trees took shape as balls for play and as stoppers for jars. Cotton thread went inland to cooler valleys, and woven cloth came back on return trips. In the other direction, corn and beans moved as supplies for caravans and hosts. Some cargoes went by canoe to speed the journey, and then up a small creek to a landing. Other cargoes went by trail around a waterfall or a swamp. At intervals, people sat together in a patio and shared a simple meal, and they repeated ties with gifts and small vows. Paddles made a soft splash. The movement of things drew ideas along with it. Visitors to La Venta saw buried mosaics and neat offerings and returned home with stories and aims. Distant places set out their own plazas and shrines with parts of that plan. In Chalcatzingo, carvings on stone showed a ruler seated within a framed space, and people there tended rain and crop rites with care. In Teopantecuanitlan, a sunken patio and carved stone seats marked a new order of gathering. In the basin where Tlatilco stood, potters made round-faced figurines and painted them, and some wore headdresses known from the Gulf. In the Oaxaca valleys, San Jose Mogote made offerings with green stone and iron ore and set buildings to face a planned space. On the Pacific slope, Abad Chacalic raised early stones with carved signs, while keeping local ways in fields and homes. Ball play spread along these routes, and heavy rubber balls reached highland courts. At La Venta and other centres, obsidian blades from southern sources were reshaped and used in households and rites. In return, people inland learned new ways to polish mirrors and to shape jade celts with a careful bevel. In every place, builders tried alignments that matched useful dates in their seasons, and they checked them each year. Floods and slides sometimes broke a route or delayed a caravan, yet the ties held. People repaired paths, found a new ford, or waited out a season, and then set off again. The stone felt cool. With time, these paths formed a wide net rather than a chain. No single town ran the whole web. Trust rested on meetings, shared meals, and steady returns. A ruler gained more by open exchange than by force, and a workshop gained more by many customers than by one. Travelers carried songs and stories along with pots and blades, and hosts learned the news of far hills and coasts. In these years, ideas about rulership and offering spread, and they settled in new soils in local forms. Some places took the carvings in full detail, others adopted only a set of motifs or a way of laying out a plaza. The Gulf lowlands gained new supplies and new skills through these contacts, and distant valleys gained part of the lowland style to anchor their own histories. In the seasons ahead, workshops would refine the shared look of jade and clay, and later, careful signs would show speech and count the days. The exchange did not erase differences, it gave them a common ground. When the season turned and the rains eased, people checked their loads and their ties, and they entered the trails once more. Evening fires glowed. Chapter 7. Hands that shaped jade and clay. The story turned to the making of small things that held steady meaning. In these years, people in the Gulf lowlands worked green stones and fine clay with patient hands. Their workshops refined a gentle style in masks, figurines and vessels. They shaped flat axes, ear ornaments and beads with careful cuts and smooth curves. They made hollow people in clay with rounded cheeks and calm mouths. Their tools were simple, but the work asked for long practice. Hammerstones, grindstones, cord saws with wet sand, and reed drills answered most needs. The carvers understood where a fracture might run. The potters kept a sense of thickness and balance in thin walls. A good piece took time, and time was not hurried. The makers did not aim at spectacle. They aimed at objects that sat well in the hand, and held form for many years. Stone came from a distance, and clay from riverbanks and low ridges. The craft tied the far and the near, through daily effort and quiet skill. Stone dust settled on their forearms. Workrooms stood in household compounds near the main plazas and mounds, and in smaller hamlets along the rivers. In the middle centuries after the rise of San Lorenzo, and during La Venta's long season, the craft spaces lay close to where leaders met, and where ceremonies took place. Some rooms sat under broad eaves, where shade made the tasks more steady. A board for grinding lay flat on the floor, with small troughs to catch grit. Basins held pulped clay, sorted from slurries to make fine paste. Trays kept proforms of stone, lined up in rows by size. In some places, piles of broken drills and flakes marked the work that had gone on for years. Children watched and learned early rules about how to hold a tool, and how to pass it. Old hands stood by and spoke short advice. The soft rasping from the grinding boards carried across a yard. The principal figures of this craft were the carvers and potters who lived within ordinary families. Some became known for a steady hand and a sure eye. They taught apprentices who were sons, daughters, or kin. Traders brought them greenstone cores and iron ore nodules, and took finished beads and plaques back along the routes. Quarry workers in distant valleys cut and dragged raw stone to places where rafts could move it. Ritual keepers stopped by to point out shapes that matched old patterns used in rites. Leaders sent for sets of matched objects for gatherings, gifts, and burials. Women and men shared tasks according to skill and habit within each household. One person held the blank while another pressed a drill. A third kept the water and grit close by. Simple meals and simple talk went on around the tasks. Hands felt the cool pull of wet clay. Work moved in steps that almost never changed. A carver trimmed a greenstone boulder into a workable blank. He pecked a rough form with a harder stone. He sawed a groove with a cord and sand until a piece split cleanly. Holes for beads and ear ornaments were drilled from both sides toward the center. Lines were incised near the end when the piece could stand the pressure. The last polish came with water and fine abrasive on a smooth board. For clay, a potter levigated the slurry to pull off the finest particles and let the rest settle. She kneaded the paste, raised a wall by coil or by pressing a soft slab, and thinned the rim with steady pinches. Molds helped with repeated parts, especially faces and small figures. A slip and a careful burnish gave a quiet shine before firing in a covered pit. The firing used even heat guarded from sudden drafts. Any piece that cracked went to the discard heap, and a new one began. Water darkened the stone as they worked. Workdays followed a steady order in these years. A clear style grew across the generations. The figurines often carried infant features and smooth cheeks, with downturned mouths that set a calm mood. Some heads bore a shallow cleft that makers cut with careful strokes. Masks showed simple brows, drilled eyes and clean edges at the lips and nose. Plaques and celts held shallow carvings of faces and bands, with even spacing and neat borders. Iron ore became mirrors through grinding and polish, and they took a clean reflection at the center. Ear ornaments fitted well to the lobe and sat paired with beads of matching color. Potters made thin bowls, bottles, and small-lidded vessels with a fine paste that took a white or grey surface. In a few places, mold use grew, and figurines reached a shared look across many compounds. Sets of celts lay in ordered bundles for ceremony or burial, and small masks rested under floors. Objects with these faces and forms began to appear in far towns, carried with other goods along the roads. The hands in the workshops answered requests from near and far, and they kept to a style that others recognized. A faint gleam came from well-polished surfaces. These forms would guide later makers beyond the Gulf lands. The meaning of this craft rested in steady care and shared memory. Small things became a bridge between households, leaders, and sacred places because they could be carried and arranged with intent. A bead worn at the ear, a mask placed under packed earth, or a mirror set in a bundle held the same calm lines that the carvers and potters taught. Skill passed from old to young, along with the sense for a curve that sat right and a wall that would hold in the fire. Offcuts, broken drills, and spent grindstones stayed behind to mark the labor of many days. When centers later shifted, the methods stayed useful, and new workshops took them up. The path opened by these hands pointed toward later carvings with signs and counts cut in the stone. In the quiet at day's end, the fires cooled. Life continued in this way. Chapter 8. Signs, Counts, and Voices. Marks and numbers took their place in the Olmec world in quiet steps. People who farmed and traded began to set down small signs that helped them remember days, offerings, and names. In time, those signs linked with counts that measured cycles, seasons, and anniversaries. The habit of reckoning days grew alongside the habit of carving stories. Later on in nearby lands, their descendants and neighbors took those habits further and cut full sentences into stone. The path began with simple marks and ended with voices that could still be heard long after the makers were gone. The Olmec heartland held the first clues to this path, and the later Epi-Olmec centers carried it onward in clearer lines. The change did not come fast. It moved at a steady pace as households learned which days were good for planting, which were set aside for visits to shrines, and which were kept for the memory of rulers and ancestors. In these years, a few trusted people learned how to tie a sound to a sign and a span of time to a number. Those habits sat beside fields, craft benches, and river docks, taking shape in the same slow way the rest of Olmec life had grown. A faint rasp of a point on clay marked the beginning of many of these records. The places where these habits formed lay in the Gulf lowlands and the nearby isthmus, from the old ridges of San Lorenzo and the island mounds of La Venta to later towns such as Tres Zapotes and other settlements on the river plains. In the seasons after La Venta's long period of ceremony, new centers kept watch over the same waterways and hills, and they made room for new carvings. The coastal air was damp. In that air, workshops and courtyards held small gatherings where a keeper of days spoke to a group, or a carver traced a guideline on stone. In these places, time felt marked not only by rain and harvest, but by named days and counted intervals. The settings changed as power shifted, but the rhythm of marking time stayed with each new place. Across the late centuries of the formative period, signs appeared more often in the Isthmus region, where old roots met and where new rulers with Olmec ties set up their courts. In those same years, the idea of anchoring a story with a date and a name became common in the region. Quiet courtyards, river docks, and open fields all became sites where counts were remembered and spoken. The work rested in the hands of several kinds of people. There were carvers who had learned to cut stone without breaking it, and to lay out signs in steady rows. There were keepers of days who knew the cycles by heart and could recite them for a visitor or a ruler. There were rulers who asked for a record of their births, their seats of power, and their ceremonies, and elders who wished to place a family offering on a named day. Traders carried the habit of counting from town to town, and they may have carried small marked objects as reminders, though such things did not survive. In some households, youths practiced counting with kernels or knots, and in workshops, signs were copied on clay and stone as hands learned the shapes. The monuments that modern people now call the Cascajal block, the Tres Zapotes Stela Se, the Tuxtla statuette, and the La Mojarraja Stela one, stood later as witnesses to this work, each in its own way. They did not stand alone, as more perished pieces once stood beside them and more hands once kept the cycles in speech. Stone dust clung to the hands of those who made these marks and cuts. At first the signs appeared in small places. A pendant or a pottery sherd held a few marks whose meanings were kept by those who made them. Bars and dots gave a clear way to show numbers. Soon the 260-day cycle, a pattern of named days known across Mesoamerica, took a steady place in these lands. It let people mark a birth, an offering, or a journey with a remembered name of the day. Those names did not survive in sound from Olmec times, but the cycle itself was clear in later records. In one place near the old center of San Lorenzo, a flat serpentine slab now called the Cascajal block held a set of signs laid out in rows. Some believed it showed early writing with signs for words. Others saw a list or a set of ritual tokens. The exact intent remained unclear. Step by step, more signs appeared on greenstone, on small figures, and on the sides of stones that stood in plazas or near mounds. People learned which signs went together, and which ones stood alone. In the following period, longer carvings took shape in the Isthmus region, and in towns that kept Olmec ways. In these years, life in the villages and towns remained steady, while the habits of counting and marking gained firmer ground. The edge of a blade clicked gently against stone as lines were squared and signs were cut. In the late centuries of the formative period, the habit of fixing a story to a date became firm in the southwest Gulf region. A way of counting long spans, known later as the long count, appeared on stones in towns with Olmec ties. At Tres Zapotes, a stela now called Stela Se, held a long number that anchored an event to a distant day. At La Mojarra, a tall stela bore a long text in what scholars later called the Epi-Olmec or Isthmian script, with a date, a ruler's name, and a chain of acts and offerings. A small greenstone figure, the Tuxtla statuette, carried both a long number and signs that named its owner and acts tied to ritual. Another early date appeared on a stone at Chiapa de Corzo, showing the spread of this way of keeping time. The signs on these monuments showed a system that could carry sentences, with signs for sounds as well as for whole words. The carvers laid out their lines in columns and rows. They tended the order of signs with care. The stories told of seats taken, ancestors named, and journeys completed. These stones showed a voice that reached beyond memory and named days with precision. The carved grooves caught a bit of rain and held it in neat lines. These markings and counts gathered up the Olmec habit of planning and gave it tools that kept shape across years. Early symbols, careful tallies, and named days let families time their plantings and their visits to shrines. In later towns, full texts tied lives to counted days and made rulership clear across a wider land. The script in the Isthmus did not spread everywhere, and it did not last beyond a span of centuries, but the habit of anchoring stories to dates endured across Mesoamerica. Other peoples made their own scripts and counts, and they used them in their own courts and temples. The quiet work of keeping days continued in villages where no stone was carved. The older Olmec centers had planted the idea that time could be held, and the later Epi-Olmec stones showed one way it could be spoken. In the seasons that followed, as rivers changed their paths and new towns grew, these habits traveled on in different forms. The river moved quietly, and life continued in this way. Chapter 9. Rivers shifted. Houses endured. In the later seasons of the Olmec story, change came in a slow, uneven way. Rivers adjusted their paths. Fields found new edges, and the old centers loosened their hold. The great projects that had filled plazas and raised mounds gave way to steadier work close to home. People tended family compounds, cleared new plots, and kept the rites that marked time and kin. No single moment ended the old pattern. Instead, the ground of daily life turned by degrees. San Lorenzo had already quieted in earlier years, and after a long flowering, La Venta also began to still. In these years, new towns gathered neighbors, and the name Tres Zapotes joined the list of places that carried weight. Laguna de los Theros stood in view of the foothills, and other settlements held their own in the humid lowlands. Stones from earlier monuments were moved or set down again. Some were cut anew, others were laid carefully in the earth. Through it all, farmers and boatmen and carvers continued their tasks. They balanced season-by-season demands with memory and obligation. The air was damp. The land in these years lay between the slow waters of the Gulf Coast and the green shoulders of the Tuxtla Hills. Rain fell in long bands, and the rivers filled, then eased, then filled again. Channels that had once been guided by embankments spread a little wider on their own. Old canals silted, and fresh cuts were made by hand where it made sense. Farms crept toward higher ground where the seasonal floods bit into former fields. Villages shifted on ridges and low rises, and new hamlets rose near fordable bends. Canoes still moved along the backwaters, and the trails across the isthmus saw quiet travel. Tres Zapotes grew near dependable water and good soils, close to stone sources and forest stands. Laguna de los Theros watched the passes where people came and went. The riverbank smelled of wet clay. The figures at the heart of these changes were not only rulers. Household heads, elders, artisans and traders set the pace. In Tres Zapotes, a circle of local leaders organized labor, watched the seasons and settled disputes. Their authority rested on known families and long ties to the land. Nearby, carvers who had trained in older styles found work shaping new stelae and reworking inherited blocks. Farmers, both young and old, planted maize and tended gardens, while fishers and boatmen supplied nearby markets. Ritual specialists kept the calendars and the offerings, and taught their apprentices the right words. Distant allies in the highlands sent obsidian, and in return received fine pottery and other goods. The foothill towns relied on one another more than on a single great capital. Households kept small shrines at doorway thresholds and in patios, and brought out treasured figures for rites. In plazas, gatherings still took place though the crowds were smaller. Stone felt smooth under a palm. The path of events followed a patient order. First came the subtle shifts in water, which over several generations pulled people from vulnerable plots and drained the strength of canals near La Venta. Then the building of large new platforms slowed. Stones from older monuments were moved to mark fresh locations, or turned into markers for smaller plazas. A few were buried with care, sealing earlier stories. At Tres Zapotes, leaders selected a central area and raised modest mounds to anchor gatherings. They set stelae at the edges of open spaces, some with old symbols, some with newer lines. Traders adjusted routes to skirt deeper marshes and to link more directly with the isthmus. Canoe landings multiplied along stable banks, and work parties maintained short causeways near fields. As seasons turned, more families found steady footing in these dispersed centers. Water lapped at the posts. Life in the villages remained steady during these years. With time, the pattern settled into a lasting shape. Authority spread across several towns, and decisions were made closer to the homestead. Rituals continued, but with more focus on household space and neighborhood shrines. The making of grand thrones and colossal heads largely ended, yet stoneworking did not disappear. New carvings favored stelae with signs and dates, and some reused blocks took on fresh meaning. In Tres Zapotes, a stone bearing a careful count stood for a long span. Laguna de los Theros kept watch over ridge paths and farm clusters. People placed small offerings in patios and near field edges, sometimes including heirlooms from earlier times. Potters in these towns shaped vessels with forms that honored older habits but carried new touches. Markets gathered on known days, and traders brought obsidian blades from highland sources, shells from the coast, and worked jades that moved along trusted hands. Some towns marked level courts for play and rite. Fields shifted to more secure ground, with shallow drains cut to keep roots from standing water. Smoke rose thin from hearths. Household life remained the foundation of the land. In looking back on these years, the story told a simple truth. Civilizations did not end in a single stroke. Rivers turned a little, houses moved, and customs found fresh rooms. The old heartlands of San Lorenzo and La Venta did not vanish. People still visited, farmed nearby, and tended memory there. But the main current of life ran through places such as Tres Zapotes and Laguna de los Theros, and through many smaller towns scattered across the lowlands. The style softened, the carvings changed, and the lines of writing grew more frequent in stone. The counts marked by priests and carvers held time steady across new generations. Later centers in the Veracruz country would rise from these bases, and traits first fostered in the Olmec age would meet new peoples and new plans. In this way, the tradition shifted without breaking. A light breeze moved through the reeds. Chapter 10. Echoes across Mesoamerica. Across the centuries, the Olmec world did not end so much as settle into other lives. Customs traveled with traders and guests, then were reshaped by new hands in new towns. Ceremonial spaces, careful counts of days, greenstone treasures, and a way of joining earth and sky passed into a wider pattern that reached far beyond the Gulf lowlands. Rulers in later cities drew on earlier forms of power. Household altars held old symbols beside newer ones. Craftspeople kept certain tools and ways of working, then added their own flourishes. In these years, ideas moved more quietly than armies. Many were adopted by people who never saw San Lorenzo or La Venta. Some traveled on borrowed stories. Others moved with the steady traffic of goods. Scholars later used the word horizon to explain how a manner of art and ceremony spread across many places with different languages. That wide sharing showed up in little things as much as in great ones. A pose on a figurine, a way to shape a throne with a cave opening, a sequence of numbers on a stone. These small threads held a memory that had begun by the rivers. In time, much of Mesoamerica shared a common way to think about space, rule, and time. That did not erase local customs. It blended with them. People kept what fit their land and their needs. What began on the Gulf Coast kept working in this quiet way, while new centers rose and fell. The air was warm, and far from the old ridges. Others kept time by the same steady counts. In later centuries, the setting spread far from the marsh edge and the low ridges of the Gulf. It reached the valleys of Oaxaca, the Pacific coastlands, the highlands of Guatemala, and the long corridors of central Mexico. Towns stood on dry spurs and broad terraces, plazas opened to the horizon, and builders aligned their work to clear markers on the rim of the sky. In these regions, seasons of planting and harvest shaped life, and ceremonies marked turns in the year. Travelers passed between coasts and uplands along routes that had been followed for generations. Caches of greenstone lay under floors in distant places. Carved thrones with niche-like fronts appeared far from their first home. The ground was damp at dawn in many of these towns, and morning tasks began before the sun stood high. In these years, memory did not need a single capital. It lived in habits, and in the layout of streets and courts. New powers added their own centers to the map. Monte Alban held its ridge above the Oaxaca valleys. Izapa grew long lines of carved stelae near the Pacific coast. Caminolju spread across the highland plain. Each had its own voice, yet each kept parts of the older pattern. The shape of a plaza, the upright stone that held a date, the buried offering that joined a household to the ground. The people who carried these things onward had many faces. Maya scribes learnt to mark long spans of days, then filled stelae with names, places, and deeds. Zapotec timekeepers set counts in their own way and carved them into hilltop stones. Rulers in different lands sat on heavy seats that showed an opening to the underworld and a place for speech. Ball players trained and served in ritual games set inside long alleys of stone. Traders moved jade across ridges, and quarry workers in the Tuxtla Hills kept lifting basalt for later projects in the region. In these centuries, local artisans softened or sharpened the old motifs. The cleft head on a mask could become a sign of rain or sprouting life, or it could be left behind for another symbol that fit a new story. Nahua speakers in late times used the word Olmeca for people of the rubber land on the Gulf Coast. Their priests kept calendars and rites that shared a clear family line with old accounts. Much later, José Melgar y Serrano described a great carved head, and the note he wrote stood at the start of renewed attention. In the 20th century, Matthew Stirling led careful digs at Tres Zapotes, San Lorenzo, and La Venta, and the dates that came from new methods pushed the story back in time. Anne Cyphers studied San Lorenzo with teams across seasons. Rebecca Gonzalez, Locke worked at La Venta and in museums. Michael Coe wrote about the art and its reach. Local workers, farmers, and town officials helped with paths, shelters, and the steady labor that such work needed. On many days in the field, the pencil left a thin grey line across a page, and a small fact joined the larger picture. Events that showed this long echo piled up slowly, and then stood firm. First came the wider spread of the ball game. Stone courts appeared at towns across the lowlands and highlands, and the game carried roles in ceremony. A rubber ball thudded against packed earth in many places, and the game marked ties between communities. Then came the deeper adoption of counts and signs. In the late first millennium before the Common Era, a long count date at Tres Zapotes set a fixed point in time. Later inscriptions in the Isthmus region, including La Mohara Stela I, carried long texts and dates that pointed to rulers and events. Over these centuries, upright stones with images and counts became central to public memory. Other forms travelled in a steady way. Mirrors of iron ore or magnetite rested in offerings across regions. Thin ear ornaments, celts and small masks kept a shape that came from earlier workshops, though later makers gave them local touches. Thrones with niches stood in plazas, and their shape reminded viewers of caves and places of emergence. In these steps, earlier habits met new needs. Some parts stayed nearly the same, others shifted to fit new rule and new ritual. In the classic period, the Maya wrote richly in their own script, but kept the base of the calendar that earlier peoples had refined. In central Mexico, Teotihuacan planned avenues and cardinal layouts that echoed older concerns for order and direction, though its art and rule were its own. Life in these regions remained steadied by counts, games, offerings, and plazas. These customs continued in the years ahead. Development followed through change and rethinking. When later empires rose, they built on a ground where such forms were familiar. The Aztecs remembered the Gulf Coast as a place of rubber and old sanctuaries, and used the name Olmeca in their own way. After the Spanish arrival, many old centers fell quiet, and fields and towns grew over mounds. In the 19th and 20th centuries, workers and scholars uncovered buried faces and stones. Some colossal heads were moved for care and display, others remained near their find spots. The Parque Museo La Venta, in Villa Hermosa, held several monuments in a garden setting. The Museo de Antropología de Xalapa cared for many sculptures and offered steady study. The Museo Nacional de Antropología in Mexico City shared them with a wider public. Tres Zapotes, San Lorenzo, and La Venta stayed as names that joined fieldwork to memory. Remote sensing, careful mapping, and geochemical tests added layers of detail. Studies tied basalt to sources in the Tuxtla Hills. Counts from radiocarbon firmed up sequences. A set of incised signs on the Cascajal block drew discussion about early writing and its date. Debates arose, but they stayed within the slow rhythm of research and review. In more recent years, LiDAR and other tools mapped hidden patterns beneath forest and field. Local communities took part in safeguarding sites and guiding visitors. Field crews brushed, recorded, and set small supports under heavy stones. Brush bristles whispered on stone while outlines appeared in full daylight. Over time, the outline of a long history became clear. The old heartland stood at the start, and the echo travelled outward in many directions. The meaning of this story rested in the way shared habits helped many peoples make sense of their world. The Olmec centers set early examples of how to shape sacred space, time counts, and public remembrance. Later communities kept the parts that worked for them and added their own order and belief. The continuity showed that a stable set of ideas could support change rather than block it. Farmers, artisans, and rulers across Mesoamerica drew from a common shelf of tools and signs. That helped neighbors recognize each other's rights across language borders, and it helped traders and guests move with ease. Museums and parks now held the stones, but the living legacy lay as much in the common logics of count, place, and offering that persisted long after the first centers waned. In a gallery where a carved head waited, the hall was quiet. Far away, the Gulf lowlands still had ridges, slow rivers, and fields that rose slightly above wet ground. Generations had passed since the first mounds, yet the pattern remained easy to trace. People kept building, counting, and giving thanks in ways that could be understood across the land. In this, the old heartland left more than art. It left a way to fit lives to the land and the turning of days. Life continued in this way. And so, dear knight, our tale of the Olmecs has reached its end. May your rest be peaceful, your dreams filled with echoes of ancient temples and forgotten lands. Until our next story, ride onward beneath the stars. Good night.